up here on the stage. We have Darren Zhu, and he's going to be talking about peer review, past, present, and future. If you want to help me welcome him and continue day 2 of DeSci.Berlin.
I'm also up here with Phillipp Koellinger, is that how you say your last name? Of DeSci Labs, who will facilitate with running a little workshop to talk about sort of new models and mechanisms for peer review afterwards. I'm going to give a short talk, sort of going through some of the history of peer review, how it kind of emerged, how we kind of arrived at the system we have today to help kind of plant the seeds of thinking about how we could sort of improve the system going forward, possibly using new Web3 mechanisms. And so let's get started. Yeah, I think we have a pretty decent sized room, so hopefully afterwards we can break out into some group discussions just to explore different topics, since there's a broad range of things that one can think about when we talk about peer review. So just to get started with a little bit of history, sort of the canonical start of peer review is often kind of reference to the first journal, Philosophical Transactions, which got started in the mid-1600s. The editor at the time, Henry Oldenburg, had set up this practice where the different researchers could kind of communicate with each other, mostly over letters in this informal way, which wasn't really a gatekeeping function of peer review at the time, more of a sort of feedback or discussion function, not too different actually from some of the things that Carol and the Protocol Labs team and Sylvia talked about yesterday in the discourse graph section in the other room. And so it was this very informal sort of system where researchers would sort of write letters to each other, providing feedback or collaboration. And I think the thing to emphasize, it wasn't really this gatekeeping function at the time, and really did not resemble the way we think about peer review today. And it didn't really even get standardized peer review for a long time. There's sort of this famous anecdote about Einstein, who had been publishing all these papers essentially without peer review at the time. And then there's this one time where he submitted to physical review, and the editor at that time, this is his paper on gravitational waves, actually sent it out to a referee to take a look and send some comments back. And Einstein was just irate. He sent this little letter back saying, we had not authorized you to show this to any specialist before it was printed. I see no reason to address it. In any case, these erroneous comments of your anonymous expert. On the basis of this incident, I prefer to publish the paper elsewhere. And he never published in physical reviews again after that. So, the rise of peer review, I mean, in the 1930s was clearly still not an established mechanism for adjudicating scientific truths. There's also this sort of famous anecdote around the Watson and Crick paper published in 1953 in Nature, which was also not peer-reviewed. And the editor at the time, John Maddox of Nature, talks about how essentially it was self-evident that the paper is correct. If he had shared it with anybody else, they would have spilled the beans. And it was also notable at the time, even in the as recent as the 50s, Nature had an extremely fast turnaround time. So when Watson and Crick sent this paper in, they had it out within weeks in the journal. And so it was a very different system than the sort of slow, laborious peer review system that we think of today. Really, modern peer review kind of emerges even just as a term and as a system in the 1970s. This is sort of like one of these Google Ngram things. Prior to the 1970s, there was not this sort of systematized, structured system of peer review. It was something that was largely informal, where journal editors could choose when they wanted to find referees of interest, and it was not something where they had this structured system. Same with grant funding, actually. A lot of the early funding agencies and philanthropists who were funding science did not necessarily use external referees for every application. It was something that was very, very much ad hoc. And really, it was in the 1970s that I think a rise of the specialization of science pushed editors and funding agencies to start using peer reviewers, as well as congressional inquiries, at least in the US, into a lot more accountability for how research was being funded, as well as what sort of research was being considered, epistemologically solid enough. And so there are a bunch of actually subcommittees on peer review in Congress in the 1970s, mostly trying to understand how all this government spending into research was being done. And in many ways, peer review arose as a mechanism for addressing those questions of accountability. Even over in in England, the Lancet editors were kind of skeptical of the United States, even as recent as 1989. This is a sort of editorial from the editors of the Lancet mentioning that in the United States, far too much is being demanded of peer review. And so I think just to plant some of this context, I think it's useful to think about peer review as not this thing that is this monolithic institution that we must rely on for sort of ascertaining which scientific projects and which scientific papers are worth funding and worth publishing, but something that is a pretty recent development. A lot of this I'm drawing from a really wonderful science historian, Melinda Baldwin, who wrote this book, Making Nature, that I highly recommend anyone who's interested in the history of publishing, and then this essay that I have a little QR code that's about sort of the rise of peer review in the 1970s in the US and how it kind of percolates around the world. So for anyone who's interested in reading more, that's some really good content there. If anyone has any questions about that, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I would kind of jump to thinking about peer review today. There's been some interesting studies recently just kind of talking about the burden of peer review. It's a largely unpaid thing, both on the funding side and on the publishing side, where researchers are largely donating their time to uphold the scientific duty of being peer reviewers. There was this paper published last year from Alex Holcomb's group estimating something on the order of over 100 million hours in terms of total reviewer time spent. Just reviewing manuscripts. That doesn't include grants or other research artifacts. And so there's a heavy burden to researchers right now that because most peer review is both unpaid and also blinded, that they don't get any reputational benefits and they also don't really get any financial benefits. There's a company, Publons, that also did this survey a few years ago of trying to understand the motivations of why people are doing the peer review. You know, a large majority, 40%, cite that it's just a part of their job as a researcher, you know, and similar numbers view it as needing to do that as their fair share to reciprocate back into the system. Some do it because they're trying to keep up with latest research, and reviewing the most recent literature is a way of doing that. But for the most part, it really relies a heavy amount on goodwill, and this makes it difficult for a lot of the editors to, you know, find reviewers. You know, 3/4 of editors say finding reviewers is the hardest part. Usually, it takes them, you know, on average, 2.4 peer review invitations to find a reviewer, and it's a challenging thing. According to this, the median time to complete a review is 16-ish days for the reviewers, which seems low to me. I know Philip was saying.
I mean, so this is clearly not a number from economics. So in economics, it's more like half a year before you get your desk rejection.
But in any case, it's a really burdensome process that we don't really have great formal we rely heavily on norms, really, to make peer review function the way it does today. And then there's a question of whether peer review actually work. And this is not a recent question. You know, this is a paper in JAMA from 1990 talking about peer review suppressing innovation. I know Sebastian in his talk yesterday was talking about all these case studies, and in this article they mentioned a few of them as well, of famous papers and famous projects that were not published or not funded through peer review processes, whether it was Carrie Mullis with PCR, you know, Catalin Carrico recently with modified mRNA. There's a bunch mentioned here that are really seminal works where, for various reasons, reviewers who lack skin in the game are not properly incentivized to take bets on sort of high-risk, high-reward research to either fund or publish. And so there's, you know, I saw this tweet last year where one of the lead authors on a lot of the COVID research mentioned that they had figured out these two particular proline amino acids on the spike protein. Originally it was on, I believe, the MERS spike protein that they were looking at, that really helps stabilize it to provide the necessary antigenic response. And they struggled apparently for years trying to get it published, and they couldn't find it published anywhere, but fortunately they published it, you know, live in the actual vaccine. And so I thought it's just yet another sort of proof point of whether peer review as a gatekeeping function works well and is necessary today in this sort of digital world. There's also a question of how much does peer review actually improve the papers. This was an interesting study that came out a few months ago where they were looking at the sort of difference between preprints that were being pushed instantly online during COVID and then the final published versions of these papers, and the delta between the sort of conclusions drawn, even just the texts were very minimal. And so there's a question of, even as a feedback system, how much is peer review actually contributing to the improvement of papers? And then there's also a lot of questions around how effective peer review is on the funding side. This was a large study conducted a few years ago looking at, I think, over 100,000 funded grants in the NIH database and trying to understand whether scoring is actually correlated with productivity, here measured by citations, which have some flaws. But essentially, once you get to, I believe, a funded grant that is 20th percentile above, so kind of passing the basic threshold filter, it's essentially random chance in terms of whether they're picking a highly productive project or not. And grants, again, take immense amount of time as funding has stayed relatively constant in basic research while sort of applications have skyrocketed. And so there's questions around whether peer review is the most effective, efficient capital allocation system for basic research. There are also studies showing really low agreement among reviewers, so sort of inter-reviewer grant ratings have high variability, and perhaps that's not necessarily a bug. Maybe you want sometimes really controversial research that provokes different reviewers different ways. But if the goal is to use review in a robust, reproducible manner, the high divergence of scoring on grants is potentially problematic. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of new ways that peer review is starting to emerge in this digital age. Now that we have things like blogs and PubPeer, which is a forum for commenting on other papers, and Twitter. This was a case study that I like a lot. I don't know how many folks here read Tyler Cowen's blog, Marginal Revolution, but there was an interesting blog post, I don't know, maybe about a decade ago when Thomas Piketty's Capital was in the news, and this economics grad student, Matt Rognally, just wrote a little comment on his blog saying, Piketty made a little mistake in terms of how he calculated the difference between, I forget, the rise in wealth versus income or something like that, and didn't take into account depreciation. And that comment kind of blew up, and eventually Rognally, as a grad student, was invited to submit a paper to the Brookings Institution around this. And in some ways, I think it shows the potential value of these open review systems for actually enabling reputational incentives for people who are leaving high-quality reviews. Sort of a no-name, quote-unquote, grad student can leave a comment on a prestigious paper in a blog that has a wide readership, which is another key ingredient here, and then kind of use that to catapult into a major economics venue and discussion. There's also been lots of examples of PubPeer, which is this sort of forum for posting, mostly posting negative reviews of papers, mostly looking for fraudulent images or other things, and primarily biomedical papers. Elizabeth Bick is a researcher who kind of pretty much does this full time now, spotting Western blots that have sort of questionable bans on them. And these are a couple recent ones of two different companies that were working on Alzheimer's. One was Cassava and the other one was Thyra, pointing out dubious papers from, I think, the scientific advisor of Cassava and the main founder, CEO of Athera. And so these are venues now for doing sort of open review that previously probably were hard to disseminate, when philosophical transactions were getting started in the 1600s. And I know yesterday we talked a little about financialized methods of reviewing science. And in this case, actually, there were some docs, physicians who, I think concurrent with Elizabeth Bick posting these allegations, at least against Cassava, had built short positions and wrote to the FDA filing that there was some fishy stuff going on. And so there is some public markets opportunities for people to do kind of financialized peer review and have some skin in the game. And in both cases, both of these companies, shortly after this sort of fraud was unveiled, had massive drops in their stock price as sort of mostly single asset, lead asset preclinical companies, or maybe phase 1 companies. And so this is, I guess, a little bit of precedent for the notion of some sort of financialized peer review. Of course, this is only taking place in public markets and in pretty special cases, but just as a I guess, case study for what potential financialized peer review might look like. Let's see what else we got. Oh, and then I guess to kind of end, to talk about some new review mechanisms, or maybe not that new. Nature actually back in 2006 was fairly prescient in trialing some open review things where they would take some of the submissions to the journal and ask the authors if they were willing to just post the submissions online and just get open comments. And they sent out a total of, I guess, 1,400 papers to ask the authors if they were willing to try this thing in 2006. About 5% or 70 of them agreed to have them displayed, and about only half of them only got comments. And this is, I think, one of the real big challenges of review, whether it's done in a centralized way mediated by editors or in an open, sort of decentralized way, is how do you actually get and motivate the right reviewers to leave comments? And of those who received comments, I think a decent number of them found them at least somewhat useful or very useful, but it shows that it's difficult to elicit high quality reviews. But again, this was kind of early days in 2006. I was actually kind of surprised that Nature was pioneering enough in some ways to try this out. There's also been a lot of experiments in the AI world, especially for their conference submissions, of doing open review where different reviewers are tasked with selecting and rating submissions for acceptance in the conference. And there's a wide literature there that actually I'm not too familiar with, but about how to kind of improve mechanism design for AI conference submissions. There's also the rise of sort of replication markets as a new way of potentially adjudicating how reliable and robust research is. There have been several sort of social science replication market studies set up where it does show that people can read a paper and have some forecasting ability to determine how robust that research is. DARPA's actually been quite interested in this and ran a program to do a broader prediction market. I think they put a few $100,000 into a prediction market around some of the social science research that they were interested in. There was also a prediction market set up for looking at COVID-19 preprints and which of those would actually be published. That recently resolved, I think, a few months ago. And so another form of sort of decentralized peer review might be something that looks more like a prediction market, although the question with prediction markets is always, can you get enough attention and liquidity into a market to make it meaningful? And let's see, a few other mechanisms. Distributed peer review. This actually came out, I think, this concept of distributed peer review, where essentially you have the researchers themselves review each other, came out of, I think, these astronomy communities where there was too many burdensome requests to use the telescope. And they're like, okay, what's the way for us to kind of allocate the time on telescope time more effectively? Well, we should just have everyone who's submitting proposals on the telescope review each other. And are there ways of preventing collusion? And are there ways of distributing that work in a fair way? And the NSF kind of was actually inspired by this in 2013 and had a particular submission where they would have everyone who submitted proposals, and the PIs could submit as many proposals as they want, but based on how many proposals they submitted, they would have to scale up how many other proposals they were reviewing. And so there's actually quite a bit of interesting mechanism design literature right now around how do you fairly do this sort of distributed peer review. And then recently, people have also been trying to use scouts. I know, in venture capital, it's very common to have scouts go out and try to find deal flow. In science, it's usually, you apply to these grants rather than have the grant makers come find you. But recently, Hypothesis Fund, I think, got launched a few weeks ago as a way to recruit scientists or provide funding to scientists that could be reallocated to other scientists they found interesting. And then speculation grants, which is a program done by the Survival and Flourishing Fund, funded by Jan Tallinn and Jen McCaleb. They've also recently been playing around with these ideas of why don't we go out, rather than solicit proposals from researchers that we then review, let's go find people that align well with our philanthropic tastes, give them that capital, and tell them to go out and fund interesting research. All right, those are all my slides.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, Philip, you had a couple, so.
Thanks. So I've been thinking a little bit about the actual functions of peer review, and so my sense is that there is basically two purposes of peer review as we currently do it. So one is gatekeeping, or giving particular pieces of work a stamp of approval by publishing it in a prestigious journal or giving it grant money. And the other one is recommendations to the authors for improvement, right? And usually these things, they happen on two dimensions. So one is novelty, so judgments about how important and how novel a contribution is to an existing field of science or research question. And the other one is rigor, so how convincing is the evidence, how likely is it to replicate, have the authors done any methodological mistakes, are their conclusions actually supported by the evidence that they're presenting, right? So now you can think of it as like this two-dimensional space where if you have work that is low on rigor and low on novelty, you basically end up there, so you have bad and irrelevant science, right? And that's, in my opinion, the primary purpose of peer review and the reason why it actually became successful and an important part of the scientific method nowadays is that we want to be able to identify that bad and irrelevant research and basically weed it out and not give it the stamp of approval, right? Then there is the dimension where something is relatively low on novelty but really, really high on rigor, and I would call that science hygiene. And an important example of that are replication studies, right? So these are studies that scientists do with the specific purpose of trying to replicate independently important results that have been reported by other researchers. The incentives for that are really weak. There is not a lot of incentives for scientists to actually do that, but I believe that it actually plays a very, very important role in the scientific method. Then you have here the lower right corner, which is basically really high on novelty, relatively low on rigor, and this is basically, you know, clickbait and the type of incentives that lead to a lot of, you know, studies that get published that are often methodologically not very well done, often based on very small samples, where the statistical evidence is misleading, the effect sizes are not precisely estimated, and very often you just end up with something that doesn't replicate, right? So if you have incentives that actually emphasize novelty over rigor, you end up with a system that produces a lot of clickbait and stuff that doesn't replicate, right? And then the ideal scenario would be that you find an incentive system that rewards both rigor and novelty at the same time, and this is what I would call scientific progress. So from my personal experience, I would put the journals that I'm familiar with and the big funding agencies into that matrix about like that. So this is not like actual data. This is just based on, you know, the thousands of articles that I've read throughout my career in science and the hundreds of reviews that I've done and the role that I played as an editor in some of these things. So there are some journals that actually do not put a lot of emphasis on novelty. They primarily just ask the referees to look at the methodological rigor of a paper and to basically accept it for publication if the conclusions that the authors support are supported by the evidence. And PLOS ONE is probably the prime example of that. Most of the journals, however, they actually emphasize novelty a lot and often at the expense of rigor. And it is particularly true for the really flashy, high-impact journals, the general interest journals such as Science and Nature. There was even an editorial by the Science editors that came out a couple of years ago where they discussed that trade-off, and they were openly saying that, yes, this is something that they struggle with. They try to find the most impactful work, and very often, if something looks to them as, you know, something that could be potentially really, really important, but is not like proven beyond any doubt, very often they basically err on the side of just giving it a shot and putting it into the paper because it's going to get citations, it's going to get attention, right? Similarly, a lot of the top field journals, the primary gatekeeping that they do is actually on the novelty of a contribution, right? So very often, work that is scientifically very well done actually gets rejected because several referees, or just one of them, thinks that the contribution or the novelty of the paper to the literature isn't big enough. And then the big funders like NIH and NSF, they're often in a situation that they cannot really evaluate the rigor very much because, you know, the researchers are basically just proposing something relatively vague about what they're trying to do, so it's really difficult to get a good handle on how well they will actually do it. and they're sort of like somewhere in between being a little bit risky and like prone to finance novel research, but they're also risk averse. They just don't want to waste money on something that's obviously not going to work out. And then maybe there's like a little outlier, the top econ journals that actually put a lot of emphasis on rigor. But what we actually have is that in the upper right corner, there is hardly anything, right? So there is hardly any journal that actually succeeds in both emphasizing novelty and rigor, and there's hardly anything that actually is a good home for very rigorous work that is not very novel. And actually, one of the things that I would love to discuss with you is how do we get up there to the upper right corner? How do we generate incentives and mechanisms that actually push science into the right direction of both novelty and rigor? Okay. Should we start breaking it out?
Yeah.
Maybe in a
That's
little,
some a few questions to maybe seed. If you click one more. Yeah, if there are questions, feel free. These are some questions that we thought might be useful to kind of seed the discussion. I feel like we don't have that many people, so we could maybe just, yeah, I don't know, pow out.
Any
in a little
questions
circle,
from
but-
anyone? So I bring the mic over. We're just going to use the mic because we're live streaming,
Okay,
so we want to
perfect.
make sure that everybody hears the question and answer. Thanks. Just a reminder to say your name when you ask the question. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Yuri. I just have the 2 points I'd like to hear your opinion on is, first of all, any system that you want to scale up usually relies on some standards. And in peer review, I believe the standards are very loose and mostly enforced by the journals themselves, so very fragmented as well. Just the first one. And the second one is that we're still publishing papers, which is in this digital age kind of strange. And you can really, like, most science is really quantitative in a sense. And how much can we actually learn from computer science, where you publish code and everything else, which can be automated, for example, for checks and balance and so on, right? So can we actually just kind of get rid of this understanding of a paper publishing to something completely different and moving science forward?
Yeah, I love that comment. So actually, I think you're totally spot on, and we're actually trying to address that by creating these DeSci nodes. So that's basically an infrastructure for scientists to create research objects instead of just manuscripts. So basically a place on Web3 where you have a central storage of the paper, the data, the code, annotations, videos, anything else that is related to your research that also has the ability to track changes over time and has unique addresses based on hashes. And once we have that infrastructure in place, these DeSci nodes, we can actually evaluate them. And we can also do things like code review and data validations, which are currently completely missing from the peer review system. And as you say, they're absolutely crucial and they actually gain an importance. So I think this is going to be an important part of scientific hygiene. Yeah.
Any more questions?
This may be a UK-centric view, but British academics are heavily incentivized around a range of bibliographic metrics, which the government calculates when deciding how much money to give universities. I mean, how do you think about that sort of, I guess that you have similar systems in other countries, so how does that sort of institutional lock-in affect any reform proposals?
Yeah, so I think that you're totally right. So, and I was trying to allude to that with this graph with the with the novelty, and this is really what this is all about, right? So the impact factor and citation counts, they're basically quantitative metrics that primarily are picking up on how much attention a piece of research is getting, right? And by putting so much emphasis on in which journals you publish and how highly they're ranked, you actually skew the incentives for all scientists towards just producing a lot of novelty at the expense of rigor, right? And you basically create a system that is prone to produce a lot of clickbait and replication crisis, which is actually really what we see in the scientific literature nowadays, right? We have a really widespread replication crisis in a lot of different fields. Some of them are, of course, worse than others, and maybe really worryingly is that one of the most important fields, medicine, has one of the highest replication problems, right? And I think you're totally right. So this is one of the side effects of creating incentives and not really thinking about what the side effects and the consequences are. And we need to learn a lesson from that, right? So now that we have the possibility to design new systems, we really need to think very, very carefully about what are the side effects of the incentives that we actually create.
Yeah, I think the point about bibliometrics is an important one, because in some ways it reminds me of generally when you have these centralized bodies, there is a rise of legibility to the, when you scale something up, how do you actually make the proof of work here legible to the funding body? And folks like Scott with Scene Like a State have written about sort of the rise of legibility and sort of the issues that causes. And in the bibliometrics case, it sort of funnels everyone down a particular objective function that they're optimizing. There's always a question of, in the world of decentralized science, and even the comment earlier about standards, do you just kind of refunnel into a new objective function that kind of perpetuates things again? I think I don't know the history of bibliometrics that well, but from what I understand, the rise of a lot of the sort of ways of sort of ranking publications, doing the citation graphs, came out of an earnest effort to try to use a lot of new technology infrastructure to actually get a sense of which research was valuable. And then now it's created sort of this metagame that causes a lot of misaligned incentives. And so I think it's a useful sort of case study to think about as we move forward in trying to build and reimagine a new decentralized science infrastructure. What are these sort of the sort of metrics that are used to assign credit and used to determine which projects are most valuable?
Hello. So my name is David. First of all, thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. You kind of already addressed that. I just wanted to ask, would you say we're moving towards a world where peer review, is extinguished completely in the way that, let's just say, a lone genius, so to speak, that is originally not from the world, where the subject of the peer review is prominent, can publish a piece of work that pierces through the peer, through the someone. I think you get the point, right? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think part of it is a question that you're trying to address. What does peer review actually mean, right? Yeah. There's a sort of pre-publication peer review that has become sort of a gatekeeping function that was previously based on scarcity, because journals could only print so many pages every month, and they could therefore only select so many papers to be printed, and that created prestige once there was a little competitive selection factor for a journal like Nature. So that's sort of pre-publication peer review, largely serving the role of sort of gatekeeping as well as evaluation. How valuable is this new research artifact that has been made? But there's part of that that's been bundled in that we've talked about. That's a feedback process to the original authors, which is this is some follow-up experiments that one should do, or this is why maybe this sort of statistical analysis wasn't quite right, and that could be potentially unbundled from the actual gatekeeping mechanism. Is the feedback mechanism. Then there's also the value of peer review in terms of dissemination. How do we actually get the research to the right communities that are interested in them? And again, those things can kind of be unbundled from the journals again. And so there's, I guess, the part of the question of is there no more value in peer review, or is peer review over, is kind of being more precise about which functions of peer review are vital to a journal-based system versus to a more online distribution system that can handle a lot of the functions of feedback, a lot of the functions of distribution, even the functions of evaluation perhaps more effectively.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, so the way that I'm thinking about it is that ideally we would want to live in a world where all science as a standard is open and accessible to everybody, right? So anybody can come in and create one of these nodes, and by default they're going to be accessible to everybody, and you can't block access to it, and so on and so forth. And peer review is still going to be an important role in that, I think, because it will serve this validation function, right? So not all research will be equally good, And you will need to have a feedback mechanism of experts in the field who actually comment on a work and maybe give it a stamp of approval, right? So you can have badges for that, you can have NFTs for outstanding work, you know, all of these things, but based on a base layer that is accessible and transparent to everybody, and where also the review process and what happened as a result of that is transparent and accessible to everybody. So this is how I'm thinking about it.
Cool. Cool. Thanks for your talk. This is Holke. Quick question. Basically, on the last graph, I put out the hypothesis that actually the biggest problem is on the top left. Like if we would solve that, then it wouldn't actually be a problem that we have very novel research that doesn't have the rigor yet. We should label that. Like if we label that, and then we have the incentives for the top left. Then we have, with a combination of journals and publications or review of the science, then we actually are in the top right. So I think the big thing is on the top left, and I like that you have also the question marks there. So I guess from your nodding, you kind of
totally. I 100% agree. So I'm a huge fan of replication studies, and I do think you're totally right about that. So once we have a system in place that actually incentivizes scientists to do follow-up work on, important and potentially interesting novel findings, where we have an incentive for them to independently check if they can replicate these results, either with a new data set or with new methods, just to try to really replicate and reproduce the original results, then I think we're going to make a lot of progress. One of the things that we can do in a DeSci system is we can literally create an incentive system where anybody who has an interest in a particular finding can put up a replication bounty or a validation grant that incentivizes scientists that are qualified in that field to work on the replication of this particular finding rather than trying to do something else, right? So this is all about incentives, and it's relatively easy to create these incentives with the Web3 infrastructure. So this is one of the many reasons why I'm actually so bullish about DeSci, because we can really change the incentives and actually push them into that direction.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's a really good point you make. In some ways, there is potentially a trade-off between novelty and rigor, because with novelty, you have something that is exciting and new, and you want to get it out as fast as possible. And that sort of makes it difficult for you to run all the follow-up studies and be as rigorous as possible. One of the things, actually, I think we were talking this Schelling point a little bit was, when Jennifer Doudna published their CRISPR-Cas9 paper in Science in 2012, there was a lot more follow-up work she could have and maybe should have done for patent reasons on, mammalian cell lines and all these other ways. But no, she got it out in Science pretty much as fast as she could, and then all these other groups kind of came in and essentially replicated that the system works very robustly across all different sorts of cell lines. And so I think, as you mentioned, there might actually be a strict trade-off, just sociologically speaking, between rigor and novelty that makes it very difficult to get to the top right in one package, but maybe you have things that are highly novel, and then you have things that are highly rigorous, and that helps us adjudicate the things that are novel that actually stand the test of time of rigor.
Just sort of an observation and then a follow-up question. So, I mean, if I think about just for an ideology of the problem perspective, I think in places like the US and in Europe as well, impact factor is really driving this sort of self-reinforcing cycle. And there's this whole culture in academia, whether it's looking at unilateral career movement, trying to go from postdoc to a tenure track position or something, where these metrics, this is the primary incentive, right? So, and beyond that, there's also this component of prestige that I think is really, really important to academics. And one of the things I've been curious about when we think about DeSci and the creation of new incentives, what do you imagine sort of recapitulating or in a way simulating the same level of prestige that you would see publishing in a certain journal? How do you, I mean, this is something that, like, Nature, for example, built this reputation up over many, many decades, right? And over a history of leading people publishing in those journals. Now I think it's debatable whether a lot of the work that is even published in Nature and is really that impactful. And I think you have this, again, a system self-reinforcing in the wrong place. But like, how do we, what does like V2 of this new incentive structure look like? And there was a period of time where I thought it could be largely financial, but I think actually if you speak to most academics, this is probably not the case. I think prestige is maybe as important, if not more important.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really, really great point, Tyler. And I coined this term prestige capture, which is kind of a derivative of this term regulatory capture that a lot of libertarians like to use when we have these centralized bodies that are responsible for regulation, like the government, whether it's the FDA or other organizations, and that creates various misaligned incentives because they are the one source that gets to regulate everybody, right? And in some ways, I think a similar sort of monopoly has emerged in terms of prestige, both in the institutions that hire people and the journals that confer prestige on the papers, where now they are sort of rent-seeking and have captured a lot of the prestige that they've built up over centuries. It's actually, if you read The Making of Nature, it's interesting to hear about the origins of nature, actually. They, at one point, had a really clear, crisp value proposition in this, back in the 1700s or 1800s, where the dominant way of publishing at that point were these monthly periodicals or books. So, researchers would pour in like a lifetime's work into these things, and they had very esoteric audiences and be expensive to produce. And Nature kind of came up with the weekly journal format where we'd bundle in lots of different small papers that we'd have very fast turnaround time and that we could disseminate to a broad audience around the globe. And as they actually offered a service that was useful, then they became prestigious over time, and then they kind of did rent-seeking behavior off that prestige. And so there's a question in this DeSci world. One, how do you be backwards compatible with this system where prestige is probably the most valuable currency in academia, and how do we play around with that? And then thinking about, in the long term, how do we avoid the same prestige capture problems that emerge? And I think it's a tricky thing. One of the ways is to go with the, oops, looks like we're out of power here, but the prestige gods are attacking us right now. But one of the ways might be to, work with organizations that are risk-taking and already have prestige and are willing to kind of try new things. I know DeSci Labs is building out a foundation with an advisory board of a lot of top researchers. Another way is to take bets on young researchers, right? It kind of reminds me of like back in the day of Y Combinator, right? Back in the day, Y Combinator is like the most prestigious funding institution, arguably, right now. But in the early days, they were taking bets on these really young, unknown, mostly college recent grads or dropouts. And that is another way of sort of building your prestige, not in the interim, but over the long term, is finding those sort of researchers that are not well served by the system today, but have a lot of promise.
Yeah, so just to add to that, I think you're 100% right. So the prestige is probably the most important driver for scientists and for their individual careers. So we're actually thinking that the system that we're building with, the DeSci nodes and the autonomous research communities that are going to do the evaluation services. So we're thinking of that as complementary to the current journal system, not as an immediate replacement and not as a threat to them. So I think we can provide something that the current journal system does not do. First of all, by giving everything, making everything open access, right? So it's basically going to be a preprint platform that doesn't take copyrights from the authors and still leaves them the choice to submit their work to whatever journal is most important to them. But then we also perform pre and post publication evaluation services, including things like reviewing the code and the data. And ideally we come up with a system where these ARCs are identifying really, really outstanding pieces of work that ultimately get published also in the traditional high prestige vanilla journals. But maybe, and my dream scenario would be that a couple of years down the road, we look at the evidence, we look at the data of what has actually been reviewed by these ARCs and what has been published in these top journals. And ideally, I would want to see a system where the stuff that gets selected by the ARCs ends up in the best journals, but is actually more robust in the end than the stuff that was not reviewed and validated in the DeSci system. And that would be the ultimate winner, because then we have an argument to say we actually make the system better.
We just want to say to the people that are joining us on the live stream, it's not their screen or lights went out for the video recording. We're going to have them back on the next session, but next question.
Hi, I'm Lawrence from VitaDAO. It's not exactly 100% sure. I'm not 100% sure if we should apply the same ideas to all across the spectrum, from basic research to whether we continue a clinical trial or approve a drug, like, hashtag Biogen Alzheimer's drug. So more relevant to us at VitaDAO, zooming into more on the early stage research grant funding or grant review. A researcher comes in with a proposal usually, so I'm going to do a quick recap of how we look at it. We wouldn't say, oh, this is a young researcher, they don't know what they're talking about, this just denied. Maybe they have a seed of a great idea there, so then we kind of work to incubate them. So it's a much more involved review than just follow-up questions. It's actually helping them revise the R&D plan. So usually a lot of scientists work with them in the team internally at VitaDAO. But then we also send it over at the end to a sort of scientific advisory board of the top domain experts to finally give a yes or a no. But they also usually have follow-up questions and help with the incubation. It's kind of a spectrum. So just kind of opening it up and zooming into the specific early stage grant review part. How would you like that to? How would you like to see that? Maybe how should we choose these scientists that work with them, or how should we choose the domain experts? Should it be up for a vote from the community for all the domain experts? And all of there's so many things that we could zoom into even more. But opening it up for people to kind of help us change that and improve it. We're always open for feedback, and if we don't have enough time right now. Always happy to and super appreciate you to help us improve that.
So my take on that is that the basic problem that we're always struggling with when we're trying to evaluate early stage research and to allocate grants is that we have to pick winners based on very, very limited information, right? And the chance of us screwing that up or making mistakes in the process is just huge, right? So it's basically like it's venture capital, right? It's like you basically have to build a portfolio where you accept the failure of a lot of different projects, and a couple of them will succeed and they will really make the world better, but it's going to be almost impossible for you to actually identify the ones a priori. So this is where I think impact certificates come in, where the idea is that it is much easier to allocate money efficiently ex post once you actually know which of these experiments worked, which of them were actually successful, and which of them actually had an impact in the world. So if you use impact certificates for that, and you basically have a huge pot of money that is just distributed ex post, you can create an incentive system where people can actually trade these impact certificates during the process and use them to allocate funds. But the ones that are actually funding the basic research or the applied research, they would walk away with a feeling and the knowledge that the money that they spend is going to be allocated much more efficiently than if they try to pick winners. So that would be my perspective.
One sort of bouncing off what you said, I think with VitaDAO, the use case is it's very different actually, because the people who are reviewing the project have skin in the game themselves, right? They have actually a really strong incentive to pick winners, which is actually fundamentally different in many cases than how most grant funding bodies or most capital allocators in that sense work. And it's the same with peer review. Most peer reviewers, it's not like if the paper ends up getting cited 5,000 times as a peer reviewer, you're rewarded or something, right? So I think the incentives with a DAO, for example, where you have this community that has ownership through a token, has this really strong incentive to work with researchers, incubate them, make sure the project is perfect. And it's sort of the same, even the scientific advisory board is incentivized the same way. And I think this goes back to a sort of earlier problem that you posed, which is what is the method for actually, currently peer review works on the basis of goodwill largely. What does that look like in the context of DeSci? And I think there's also intrinsic issues with it being a financial incentive as well. It can work in some cases, but it can also create a huge amount of problems. So, yeah, but I think it's an interesting question. I would be curious to see how other DAOs that are building in the DeSci space are planning to do this as well.
Absolutely great presentation. Thank you very much for it. This is something I used to work in academic publishing in the beginning of my career, and this is something I'm extremely passionate about. Because I have now moved over fully to the DeSci. I'm Isabel and I'm a molecule. So I've got 3 points I'd like to very briefly make. One on roles, because I think you hit on something really important in terms of what are we trying to achieve with peer review. Second, on expertise and the role of different expertise. And thirdly, on status and prestige. I will do these very quickly. I'd love your thoughts, or I'd be interested in talking to anyone else after who'd like to discuss this further. So firstly, on roles, Lawrence and Tyler were just hitting on this. There's a bunch of people who work in science and science as a field, and one of my favorite researchers is called James Evans. I saw him do a great presentation of the different roles that funders have in funding different types of research. So the NIH tends to fund research that basically has a pretty high chance of success. It may not always do this intentionally, but by building panels where they have to reach high levels of consensus, they move the field forward in terms of quite big, safe bets, large teams. Let's get this stuff pushed through. DARPA plays quite a different role, perhaps more akin, he thought, to venture capitalists who place much more different types of bets, much riskier bets. And he said it was very interesting. You see completely different people in these organizations. The people at the NIH and the people at DARPA, personality-wise, he finds to be quite different. So I think there's something that, rather than this just coming through from that we sort of notice it downstream, it's like some of these things maybe should be brought to the fore and be like, okay, here are pots of money for risky research, here are pots of money for moving the field forward. And we should maybe think about that in the Web3 space. Secondly, on expertise, sometimes I wonder if expert peer review in itself is part of the problem. You were hinting at it in some ways, but they've shown that experts, when they have them on TV, say, predicting what they think will happen over the next 6 months, they tend to be wrong more than the level of chance, because they're almost too deep, and this is this well-known expertise phenomenon. Some of the most impactful things that have changed science have actually been in a different field from where they originally discovered, and this is why also funders want to fund interdisciplinary research, because it's touching on two different fields, or they explode a new idea in someone else's head. So just putting the research in front of people of the same area perhaps is another part of the gatekeeping process, along with other biases that people might have in favor of wanting to push forward their own career versus other people's. And thirdly, and this is something I'm particularly interested in, this is where I think Web3 has this biggest role to play, and you're talking about it here, but is this role of status. And I don't know how many people here have read an essay called Status as a Service by Eugene Wei. He's talking about social media, but one of the big things he puts forward is that humans are fantastic at seeking status. He says we're all status-seeking monkeys, and we are fantastic at getting the most efficient way to reach status. And he says that you can predict the rise and fall of different social media platforms through that. It's an amazing essay. But I would submit that possibly among many human endeavors, research is perhaps, and the players in the research space are status as a service mechanisms. Journals, certainly, I think the primary thing they offer is status as a service. I believe, and I'm new to Molecule, and I still want to unpack this more with the team, that if we in Web3 can find a way to ethically create this status as a service mechanism throughout the Web3 DeSci space with new incentive mechanisms, we can perhaps unlock completely different types of behavior very quickly. And so to kind of round this up, one of the things I think that needs to happen is to unbundle the roles of people in the system. We see it in VitaDAO to a degree, but you can start providing incentive mechanisms to people with different roles. Like maybe some people are fantastic at curating science, but not doing science. And at the moment, we have the people doing science who are also curating the science. And if we could start to split out these roles, perhaps we can bring a lot more people into the game and incentivize new participants to fulfill the roles that we think should be happening. And yeah, any of your thoughts on any of that, I'd be very interested to hear.
Yeah, no, those are all really fantastic points and a lot to say. I think, yes, on the first point, in terms of thinking about science funding maybe as like a portfolio management analogy in some ways, you know, we have largely just old school index funds that dominate the space, like the NIH or, you know, so some of the European funders that are extremely conservative, want to fund like old, established, tenured faculty. Usually you can look at the curves of the average age of people getting funded by NIH, and they're just only rising now. And we need more diversity, essentially, in terms of the sort of people willing to take higher risk, higher reward, earlier bets. You know, I know David Lang and Experiment Foundation has written a little bit about like the notion of science angels, and that's why some of these science scout programs I had on a few slides ago, or just general research scout programs are interesting as a new model for thinking about like what does an angel investor look like in funding basic research, where they can take quick unilateral bets. Some programs like Fast Grants, which various philanthropists in Silicon Valley funded over the past few years for COVID research, is another kind of example of nimble, fast funding and bring a new sort of flavor and diversity to how basic research gets funded. So I think that point is really well taken in terms of thinking about new models for funding that are not the old monolithic safe way. And then on the status front, I actually think this is something that's really interesting from a few different angles. On one side, you see something like effective altruism gaining a lot more in status now after being sort of a niche thing like a decade ago. And in some ways, the thing I think about is like effective altruism is as powerful as it is because it's like a meme. It's actually kind of like a mimetic altruism thing where like utilitarianism generally is a meme that people can grok pretty easily. Like speaking of legibility earlier, being able to quantify something like quality adjusted life years per dollar donated is something that's like very, very mimetically attractive to people who are sort of quantitatively minded. And so that has led to sort of the rise of EA becoming a more and more powerful presence philanthropically, and various crypto people being kind of EA adjacent is an interesting trend as well. But I also think in the crypto world, it's been interesting to see the rise of NFTs as the status conferring thing. We have some of the highest status people in society, whether it's like, I don't know, Jay-Z or Steph Curry or some of these other folks, change their Twitter avatars to NFTs. And clearly they're not making that much money off shilling these NFTs. There's some sort of like luxury status thing that is happening there. And there's a question of whether we can engineer that status. It's very difficult to engineer status, but to be more aligned with things that have value like research. And so there is something very interesting about the intersection also of status with money, because money cannot necessarily buy prestige. I think a little bit about like prizes, for example, in science are largely about the prestige. Like the Nobel Prize gives you, I don't know, like $1 million, maybe a little over $1 million for research or something like that. It's not actually that much money. It's about the status it drives. And there are some Silicon Valley philanthropists that try to start an alternative prize, a breakthrough prize that gave like 5x more money, but it has none of the status, right? And they bring all these celebrities in every year to like award these prizes, and it's really hard to engineer status sort of top down. So, but I think that's part of what makes me excited about crypto is there's so much community bottoms up growth that happens, and can that status come from the community bottoms up? I think is a really good question to think about.
So just to jam on that a little bit, so I think you made a lot of like really, really good points, and one of them, so I do think that there is a lot for us to gain in more specialization, as you alluded to in your comments. But one prerequisite for that is that we actually would have to reward people who are specializing in review services and in evaluation services and trying to pick the winners. So that would actually mean that we do not rely completely on pro bono evaluation services of the scientific community. We would have to give people an actual payment so that they can specialize on providing these sorts of things. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I'm actually a huge fan of embracing the randomness of funding, right? So we know from all the numbers that a lot of it is just down to pure luck. So why don't we embrace it, right? So why don't we like literally randomly allocate funds to projects that may be very, very short descriptions of what they want to work on, and the only filter is that these people are qualified scientists and that we believe that they can do something, and we just randomly allocate them startup grants. They don't have to be large, but just, give everybody a chance to get one of these things, and then look 2 or 3 years later, what have they done with it? Don't look at bloody publication counts or whatever. Just let them talk about what they've actually done with the money. What is the progress that they achieved? And if they actually have something to show, give them more money. And like by embracing the randomness, we could also do like literally we could study the impact of the money that we're allocating, because right now we can't. Right? Because we don't have a control group. But if we randomize, we do have a control group, we can actually analyze the impact of our funding, and we can even randomize between different types of funding allocation mechanism and find out which of them is actually most successful. All of that is only possible in Web3, ultimately.
So our last question is actually going to be from somebody watching the live stream, and this is from Jesus del Valle, and I think it's a good question to end the session. He says, so what do they propose concretely to have better and quicker peer review? What do you propose concretely?
Yeah, no, it's funny. We had a similar question at Denver about, like, there's a lot of interesting sort of ideology and vision and values for what we want to do with peer review. I think, how does that actually concretely translate into products for a peer review? I think one of it is making reviews something that actually can confer reputation and potentially financial incentives, where we can actually longitudinally track who is reviewing which projects, either from a funding standpoint or from a curation or evaluation standpoint on the publishing front, and actually track that over the long term, which right now most venues don't have any way of tracking reviews. And I think that's actually something where it's a tricky balance between sort of the privacy and the transparency of reviews, because you want to ideally elicit reviews that are as honest as possible, which is why sort of this blinded system of peer review has emerged, where the reviewers are almost always anonymous and the reviews are almost always not provided, at least publicly. And so thinking about what the product space looks like there is something I think that is something concretely that we can build right now and that we're actively building for peer review. I know you guys are working on curation and other things. I'll let you kind of speak about that.
Yeah, so the way that we're thinking about it is that these autonomous research communities, or these ARCs that we want to start, the idea is that they should attract the best scientists of each field, bring them together, and give them a possibility to actually earn money with the review and evaluation services that they're providing. And it's really key that it's really the best people in each field that come together in these ARCs to provide these evaluation services. And then in order for them to have an incentive to do that quickly and honestly, we could have basically a payment schedule that depends on how much time they actually needed to provide that review. And there may also be some sort of influence of actually evaluating the evaluators. So how exactly we're going to do that, I don't really know that. If you have any ideas, I would love to hear it. But I think that the crucial thing is really to bring the best people together and to reward them for that stuff that they're doing, and to give them more of a reward if they're doing it quickly.
Thank you so much, Darren and Philip. This was a great session. We are actually now going to go to break, and please thank them with an applause. And I'm going to use that applause also to thank our sponsors. Thank you so much for helping the team making DeSci.Berlin happen. We have 2 amazing sessions coming up on stage 1 and stage 2. I'll be announcing them as soon as we're back, and see you here in half an hour. Thank you so much.